In this video, we're going to demonstrate how to load up an existing C++ program using the Microsoft Visual C++ 2010 Express IDE, and also how to create a program from scratch. And for the purpose of doing that, we'll be working with the very first program in C++ for Programmers, the book on which this live lesson is based. Now that program is simply going to display a line of text. So the first thing you'll need to do if you're going to work with Visual C++ is either install the Visual C++ 2010 Express Edition, or if you have a full version of Visual Studio, that will work as well. Now the Express editions are free for download from this website, Microsoft.com/Express, and if you don't already have the IDE installed, you can go to the Downloads tab, and here you'll see that there's downloads for Visual Studio 2010 Express and also for the prior version, Visual Studio 2008 Express as well. Now, within the Visual Studio 2010 Express tab, you can see links to the different language products that Microsoft offers for free via this website. And one of those is the Visual C++ 2010 Express IDE. So if you go ahead and download and install that IDE, then you'll be ready to work with the C++ Fundamentals live lessons parts 1 and 2 in a Windows environment. Now there are many other IDEs out there that you can use for C++ development. If you're working on a Linux, Unix, or Mac OS system, you might want to consider using the Eclipse development tools from eclipse.org, and those allow you to work with C++ as well. On the Mac environment in particular, you can also work with the developer tools that are provided by Apple, the so-called Xcode integrated development environment. And if you're interested in some of those other IDEs, take a look at the different dive into videos like this one that we've provided for other IDEs. So now we're going to assume that you've already got Visual C++ installed, in which case you can go to your Start button and All Programs, and you'll find a category called Microsoft Visual Studio 2010 Express, and within that category you'll find the Visual C++ 2010 Express link. So I'm going to go ahead and load up the IDE. Now when you first enter the development environment, you'll see on the left side here the so-called Solution Explorer window, and basically in Visual C++ the Solution Explorer is where you'll see all of the files for the particular program that you're working on. Now a solution is technically one or more projects in Microsoft terminology, and each project could be a separate program or a software component that's used by other programs. For the purpose of this C++ Fundamentals Live Lessons product, each of the solutions that we look at is actually going to contain just one project. Now you also see the start page when you first load up Visual C++ 2010 Express, and you'll see something similar in the full Visual Studio as well. If you've worked with any projects previously, you'll see some number of those listed here in the recent projects list, and that allows you to just click a link to open up a pre-existing project. You'll also see here that you can create a new project and open an existing project. Now for the moment, what I'm going to do first is open an existing project, because a lot of what you're going to be doing as you work with this live lessons product is looking at existing source code that came from our book C++ for Programmers. So let's go ahead and create a new project, which we can do either by clicking this link on the start page, or we can go to the File menu and select New Project, which I'll do for the moment. Now, when we select New Project, we're presented with the so-called New Project dialog, and in particular, we're going to be working with so-called Win32 console applications throughout this book. C++ for Programmers is geared towards presenting standard C++, not visual C++. It doesn't have any GUI associated with it in the standard C++ language, and here we'll be focusing on the language itself and the standard C++ libraries. And to do that, we'll be working with command line or so-called console applications. So we're going to choose Win32 console application, and for the purpose of this demonstration, I'll call my project test, but you can name it whatever you want. And by default, it's going to place the project in this directory, but you can actually place the project wherever you like. In my case, I've installed on my computer's C drive an examples folder, and this is the full set of examples for C++ for programmers, and I'm just going to store the project that I'm creating in this examples folder, and I'll actually often reuse the same project just by adding new C++ source code files to it and removing previous ones that I'm no longer using. But you can also create a separate project for every program as well. So I'll go ahead and select that folder, and now what it's going to do is it's going to create a directory for this solution in the examples folder on my C drive. So let's go ahead and click OK. And now we're presented with a wizard for configuring this console application. Click the Next button, and now you'll be presented with the application settings. And for the purpose of the examples in this book, again, we're going to be dealing with console applications, and we're going to work with empty projects. So we're going to check the empty project to start out, and we'll go ahead and click Finish. And when it's done, it's going to create our actual solution and project. So the solution is called test, and then it's got one project within it called test as well. And again, you could potentially have multiple projects within a given solution. Now, in C++, you're going to typically be working with at least what we call header files and source files. Header files typically have the .h extension. Source files typically have the .cpp extension for C++, and in fact Visual C++ and just about all C++ compilers out there are also capable of compiling C programming language programs, and the way that the compilers typically differentiate between C and C++ programs is based on the file name extension. So if it's .cpp or sometimes .cxx, that typically represents a C++ source code file. If it's .c or .lowercase c specifically on Unix and Linux and Mac OS systems, that would typically indicate a C program. So in fact, the steps that I'm giving you here will work for either C or C++ programs. You just have to name your program files correctly for the compiler Microsoft Visual C++ to figure out how to compile the program properly. Now, when you have your project and you have existing source code that you'd like to test, what you can do is you can right-click the appropriate folder where you need to place the source code and select Add Existing Item. Now, as I mentioned, we have header files and source files. Header files you typically add to the header files folder, and again, those are files that have the .h extension. We won't be working with header files until later in the book. And then separately, the source files are the files that end with .cpp for C++ files or .c for C files. So I'm going to select Existing Item. And again, I mentioned that in my examples folder on my C drive, I have all the source code for this C++ for Programmers book, and within the Chapter 2 folder is the first program that I'd like to use for the purpose of this example, and that's Figure 2.1. And just in terms of the naming of our files in the C++ for Programmers book and accordingly in this C++ Fundamentals live lesson, basically each figure contains the word fig, the chapter number that it came from in the C++ for Programmers book, and then the figure number that it came from. And we use 2 digits for the chapter number and 2 digits for the figure number, so if it's a single digit number, it's always going to have a leading 0. So we've selected the figure 21.cpp file, and I'm going to click Add, and now you can see that file displayed in the source files folder. And if I go ahead and open up that file by double clicking it, you can see the actual source code for this program. Now, I'm going to go ahead and run the program, which I can do several different ways. I can press the F5 key, or I can click this Start Debugging button, which also has in parentheses F5 indicating the key that you can use to run, or you can select the debug menu's Start Debugging command. Now you'll notice when I run this program, first of all, it has not yet been compiled, so it's telling me that the project is out of date and asking me that if I'd like to build it, so I say yes. It shows me the results of building the program down here, and if there were any error messages, they would have been displayed in that output area. And you may have noticed that the program ran, displayed a window quickly on the screen, and then that window disappeared before I even got a chance to look at it. And this is typical of running in debug mode. If you don't have some sort of interaction with the user in the program, in this case the program simply displays the string "Welcome to C++", what's going to happen is it will display that string, and then the program will terminate, and the window, the console window or command line window, will simply display and disappear very quickly. So if you want to run the program and keep the window on the screen so that you can study it, you can run the program in what we call release mode, and the way you can do that is by typing Control F5. So I'm going to do that now, and when I do, you can see that I get my console application window. It says "Welcome to C++", and then the press any key to continue is added automatically by Visual Studio or Visual C++ in particular when I run the program in release mode, and it's a console application. So as soon as I'm done studying the output, I can press any key on my keyboard, and that window will then be dismissed, and now I can go back to my editor and work with the program again. Now, in this case, we were showing you how to load up an existing program that had a single source file. I can also load up programs that have multiple source files. So let me remove this file from the project. I'm doing this by right-clicking the file and selecting the Remove option. I can also hit the Delete key. And now I'm back to an empty project. Let's now go ahead and add to our project files that make up a multi-source file program. So we can do that once again by right-clicking Source Files, selecting Add an Existing Item. And for this purpose, let's go to Chapter 3, where we introduce our first multi-source file program, and specifically we'll go to figures 3.11 through 13 from Chapter 3 of C++ for Programmers. And here you can see that we have a couple of .cpp files and a .h file. Now I'm going to select just the two .cpp files. I did that by holding the Shift key and clicking both of them. I can also select individual files by holding the Control key as well. You can see it's going to load up both of these files, and when I click Add, I see both of the files here in the source files list. Now, one of the things you'll notice is that in each of these source files we have a line that says include gradebook.h. Let's go to the gradebook.cpp. Here is gradebook.h being included again as well. Now we can specifically add the header file to the header files folder, but in reality all we need to do is compile and run this program, and this line of code is going to bring in the header file for us automatically. So I'm going to go ahead and type Control F5 once again. It's going to ask me to build the program, so I'm going to go ahead and do that. And you can see that it produced the output, and it says press any key to continue. I did not have to explicitly put the header file into the header files folder. However, it does not actually show you the header file in the header files folder unless you explicitly import it into the project. So if you'd like to edit the header file as well, you'll right-click the header files folder, select Add Existing Item. Here's my header file from the same folder. I'll click Add, and now I have my header file showing in the project as well. So now we've looked at running an existing program with a single source code file, and we've also looked at running an existing program with multiple source code files. And the thing that's important about that particular demonstration is that when you have a program with multiple source code files, those files have to be compiled and linked together, something we'll discuss in much more detail in Lesson 2 of this C++ Fundamentals Live Lessons product. And so in order to get them to both be compiled and linked together, they all must be part of the solution. Now let's go once again and clear out our files here. By the way, as you learn C++ in more detail, you're going to learn about the fact that each program can have only one so-called main function, and if you accidentally have more than one program in the same project and each of those programs has its own main function, that's going to prevent the project from compiling and executing. So if you want to reuse the same project over and over and over again for multiple different programs, you have to make sure you remove your prior programs before you add new ones so that you can compile and run correctly. Now let's assume we wanted to create a C++ source code file from scratch, and that we would like to create a simple single source file program. What I'm about to show you really is for any number of source files that you want to create. I'm going to right click source files and select add new item, and now I get the add new item dialog. And you can see that I've got a number of different types of things that I can add. The two things that you would typically add for the purpose of this live lesson are .cpp files, which again are C++ source files, or .h files, which are C++ header files. If you wanted to do a C file, you would select C++ file and simply name the file with a .c extension instead of .cpp. So let's go ahead and select C++ file, and for this purpose I'll just call it test.cpp, but you can name the file whatever you want as long as it's got the .cpp extension to indicate that it's a C++ source code file. Typically we will name our files based in the book based on what chapter number and figure number it is, or sometimes when we get into the concept of classes based on what the class name is. But again, as long as you have the right file name extension, it's really somewhat irrelevant what your file names are. It's a good practice to name them in a way that you understand what their purpose is. So I'll call this one test.cpp and I'll click add. And now I have my test.cpp source code file, and it's got no code in it at the moment, so I can now start working from scratch. Now I'm going to basically just type in the program that we started with today. So I'm going to include the IOStream header file, which gives us access to the capabilities of input and output in C++. And I'm going to create a main function. And within main, I'm going to simply output a line of text. So for the moment, I'll type it similar to what we did in the original program here. And I'll say welcome, welcome to C++, exclamation point. And \n says add a new line character, which moves the cursor in the output window to the next line. Then I'm simply going to type return 0, which indicates successful termination of the program. And at this point I will stop, and I will go ahead and type Control F5 once again to run this in release mode. And once I build it, assuming I didn't have any errors, which I apparently do in this case, it would run. Now in this case I got an error, so I need to go ahead and take a look at what the error message was, and it says that it can't open the file IOSteam because I spelled it wrong, and it's supposed to be IOStream, so it's kind of nice that I accidentally got an error message here. So I now see that I've got properly spelled header file name for the purpose of this example. I no longer have a red squiggly indicating an error, and now when I type Control F5, it's going to first save the source code file's changes, which it does automatically. Then it's going to ask me if I want to build, so I'm going to go ahead and build, and this time it succeeded. I displayed welcome to C++, and it has the press any key to continue. And again, if you want to do multiple source code files, which you will need to do in later lessons for this live lessons product or in later chapters of our C++ for Programmers book, all you need to do is select source files, right click it, select add new item, and then choose whether you need to add a C++ file or a header file. And again, for header files, we will typically want to do that by adding them to the header files folder to keep our projects nice and organized.